Today we get to start chapter 14, which is all about psychological disorders. And we've broken this down into a bunch of different little sections, but the first section is looking at the scope and nature of psychological disorders. And this is just a big fancy way to say that we're going to be laying some groundwork for the rest of the chapter. So let's start by talking about how do we define something as being abnormal, something that would be then classified as a disorder. What are some of the things that we keep in mind when we're doing this? Now, before we get into this chapter, I want to let you guys know that this is the chapter in psychology where a lot of students look at the disorders that we're talking about and they start thinking, hey, this sounds really familiar. This sounds like something I do. Please take all of this with a grain of salt because it's pretty easy to start falling down that rabbit hole of self-diagnosis and feeling like you identify with a lot of these disorders, but for the most part, it is highly statistically unlikely that you have one of these disorders. And if you do, you've probably been diagnosed at this point in your lives. So don't freak yourselves out. That's all this is meant to say. Now, on that note, our textbook starts by talking about the fact that psychological disorders are fairly common. As many as 1 in 5 Canadians suffer from some kind of diagnosable psychological disorder. And throughout our lives, about 50% of North Americans are going to experience a psychological disorder. So it's a pretty common thing. But for something that's so common that so many of us are going to experience, how do we even decide if a particular behavior counts as a disorder? How do we decide what is abnormal, something that should be diagnosable? And so the textbook presents 6 statements that help us try and figure out, is this thing abnormal? And some of them are useful and some of them are not. We're going to pick them apart a little bit. So these 6 are, 1, the personal values of a given diagnostician. So the person who's deciding if you have a disorder or not, the person who's deciding if this behavior should be considered abnormal or not. That is one way that we could decide that a behavior is abnormal. Our second point would be the expectations of the culture in which a person currently lives. So if that person lives in Canada, then is that behavior abnormal by Canadian standards? We can also look at the expectations of the person's culture of origin. So if they weren't born in Canada, maybe they were born somewhere else, we'd look at those cultural standards. Number 4 is general assumptions about human nature. So the idea of what we think humans should be or how they should act. 5 and 6 are getting a little bit closer, where we start looking at things like statistical deviation from the norm. Maybe we can quantify normal behavior, and anybody who deviates significantly from that behavior, that standardized norm that we've created, then that's abnormal. And then number 6 is when we start looking at harmfulness, suffering, and impairment. So if that behavior is causing harm, suffering, or impairment of their normal lives. So let's think about these. Option number 1, the personal views of a given diagnostician, well, that's fairly biased. And that would vary dramatically depending on who that diagnostician is and how they were trained and their personal opinions. So that's not a great way to do it. Numbers 2, 3, and 4, those are all going to vary based on time and culture. So if we're looking at the culture you're in, or the culture you were born to, or how we perceive human nature, that's all pretty fluid. So different cultures have different views on what is considered normal, and those views can change over time. An interesting example of this is that being homosexual was considered a form of mental illness all the way up until 1973. So up until that point, it was a diagnosable illness. And even to this day, there are some people who think of that as something abnormal, something that should be categorized as deviating from normal. So, personal and cultural opinions, not so great options here. If we look at number five's an interesting one because on the surface, that sounds like a fantastic way to do it. Like, let's categorize everything, let's quantify those behaviors, and let's find normal statistically. But if you think about it, you can remember back to the beginning of the semester when we talked about statistics. When you have a normal distribution, there are two sides to that graph. So our normal would be somewhere in the middle here. And you can have people who are abnormal by sort of underdoing a behavior. And then you can also have people who are abnormal overdoing the behavior. And that can get kind of confusing. So what if it's something like friendliness? Well, it could be bad to be severely unfriendly. And that would be at this end of the spectrum, but is being overly friendly a bad thing? Is that an abnormal behavior? I don't know. So that brings us to option number 6, which is looking at the harmfulness or suffering or impairment caused by that behavior. So if the behavior is distressing to the individual, if that behavior is making the person doing the behavior feel awful, it's probably not a great thing. If it's making other people in their society, maybe their family and friends, feel bad, then maybe that's abnormal too. So if we can hit a couple of those, this idea of like harmfulness or distress to that person and others around them, it's maybe a little bit closer. Now, I suppose this is a good point to note that we might experience some distress after certain behaviors, but it isn't on its own enough to call a behavior abnormal. So maybe you go through a breakup. That's a distressing situation. Breaking up with someone was distressing, but it isn't necessarily abnormal because a lot of people break up. So distress alone isn't going to be a good thing. And that kind of leads us to the next slide here, where we can talk about 3 factors that seem to kind of work together to help us identify an actual abnormal behavior. So this idea of it being distressing to either yourself or others, so the person who's doing the behaving might feel distress, or maybe the people around them are distressed or off-put by that behavior. We also want to look at dysfunction, where it's not a functional or not an appropriate behavior. Maybe it leads to that person struggling to operate in society. It's dysfunctional because they find it hard to do a job or go get their groceries, or maybe they can't live on their own. There's all sorts of different methods of dysfunction there. And then the last D of the 3 Ds when we decide if something is abnormal would be deviant. And in this case, we're usually looking at things that are violating societal norms. And norms, again, if you remember, are sort of the rules of society. That's the rule that says that when you get into an elevator, you should turn around and face the door that you entered in because that's the way you're going to leave. So if you're going against social norms, that can contribute to a particular behavior being deemed abnormal. Now, if we use the example of getting on an elevator, if you get on the elevator and face the back wall of the elevator, that alone isn't necessarily enough for it to be a diagnosable problem. It's going to be a little bit abnormal because you're breaking social norms, you're distressing a couple of other people, but it isn't overly dysfunctional. You're not ruining someone's ability to go about their day, and you're not throwing your own day off by standing backwards in an elevator. So it's a little weird, but it's not necessarily diagnosable. But when we find things that we're going to end up diagnosing, when we're looking at all of these different disorders, they're usually going to tick all 3 of these boxes, and usually in a pretty severe degree. And we'll talk about spectrums of severity in later sections.